So good morning or good afternoon to you all. Officially, my name is Megan Barrett and I am the director here at the Iowa Quilt Museum. And I am sitting in the gallery of our string theory exhibit, String Pieced Quilts from Past to Present. Although today we're not really talking about this exhibit. Today we are going to be joined by Marianne Fons and Jody Sanders. And the topic of this program is quilt publications. And Mary and Jody are both Iowa connected, and they'll have lots to tell us about that. But just a little quick introduction to the Iowa Quilt Museum if you have not been here yet, or if you're finding us for the first time. We are located in Winterset, Iowa, which is in Madison County. And yes, it's those bridges of Madison County that we're talking about. The book, movie, musical are all based on the bridges here in Madison County in Winterset. We are also the birthplace of John Wayne, and there's a museum dedicated to that here. And of course, the home of the Iowa Quilt Museum, in addition to two really fabulous quilt shops just within steps of us, and great shopping and other great things to visit. So if you are looking for a place to go once travel is happening again, or once you're feeling comfortable traveling, we invite you to come visit us here in Winterset, Iowa. I'll tell you a little bit more about the museum later and how you can learn more, but I'm gonna go ahead and spotlight our guests so that we can introduce them. Mary Fons is joining us from Chicago, and Mary is a Winterset native, daughter of Marianne Fons, and has been in the quilt publication world for a while. Yeah. Kind of maybe since birth, you might say, or maybe not quite. And then Jody Sanders is the editor of American Patchwork and Quilting, which is a publication of the Meredith Corporation. And Meredith is located or headquartered in Des Moines, Iowa, just up the street from us. And so I'm going to give each of these guests a little bit of time to introduce themselves and tell us about themselves, their publications, what they do in this quilt publication world, how they got there, etc. And I think we nominated Jody to go first. Is that right?
All right. Well, my story starts in the 19th century. So back in 1889, Gertrude Weil was born. And she was the oldest, the only daughter. She had 6 younger brothers. And one of her younger brothers was my grandfather. When Gertrude turned 100 years old, we had a party for her at the Good Samaritan home in Lorenz, Iowa, and that's where she lived. And for that party, everybody brought quilts that she had made for them and brought those quilts. We displayed them in the activity room, and she went around and talked to the person that brought the quilt and about the occasion that she made that quilt for. My mom brought a quilt that Gertrude had made for my parents when they got married in 1962. And as the oldest granddaughter in my generation, I was like, I want to do this. I want to be the person in my generation that does this, because she had such a connection with each of those people, even though she didn't have any children of her own. The quilts and the connection that she had with the person that she made it for, and that they had kept it for all of those years, just really touched me. So I started going to the library and getting books. I started taking classes. This would have been in 1989. And so at that time, there were a lot of adult education classes that were being held. And so I took classes, I read books, I joined the Iowa Quilters Guild, I joined a local guild. I was all in. At the time, we had a 4-bedroom house, and it was just my husband and I. And so I took over one of the bedrooms as my sewing room, and I spread out everything, and I was in. So for the next few years, I continued to be involved in different groups and guilds and take classes and just do everything that I could that was quilt related. In 2013, I got the opportunity to start a new job. I'd been working at Iowa State University for 16 years in research, and I got an opportunity at Meredith Corporation to become a staff writer with American Patchwork and Quilting. And they really took a chance on me because I had a degree in social studies and secondary education, sociology. So I didn't have a journalism degree, but I had been a quilter for 15 or 16 years at that point. And so I did have that. And they said, we can teach you the rest of this. So as I started that job, I was a staff writer and then an assistant editor. I was the editor of Quilts and More, the editor of American Patchwork and Quilting. This was the picture of my mom with my Aunt Gertrude at that 100th birthday party. And I'm so glad I have this picture because it's the moment that I decided I wanted to become a quilter. And how many of us have that we can fall back on? And so I'm so glad that I have this photograph of my mom and my aunt at that party. So as I, again, started making quilts and getting involved in quilts, as we're often asked to do, I would speak at different guild meetings and I would tell them the story about how I got inspired to start quilting. Well, my mom, who's not a quilter, came to one of those presentations to listen to me speak. And afterwards, she said to me, Jody, you're going to get this someday anyway, but I want you to have Aunt Gertrude's quilt. And this is Gertrude here sewing. She was 100 years old at this time. She's sewing at the center. This was a picture that was in her local newspaper. And it just talked about that during current events time that she couldn't just sit there, but that she would have her little box of sewing. And that's who I want to be when I turn 100 years old. Anyway, my mom came to listen to the presentation. And as a retired language arts and speech teacher, she knew the value of a good visual aid. And so she gave me Gertrude's quilt and said, I want you to have this. You need to take this with you and show it to people when you talk about the quilt. So this is the quilt here that my great Aunt Gertrude made for my parents in 1962. My mom used the quilt. It has a little bit of fraying, but the work is impeccable. The quilting on it, the applique, it is a stunning quilt. Now, as I took it and showed it to these different speaking engagements that I went to, I didn't know the pattern. I did a little bit of research, but not a lot. And so every time I would show it, I would ask people, do you know what the pattern is? And nobody knew what it was. Well, for my 50th birthday in 2013, I attended an Iowa, Illinois Quilt Study Group meeting in Kelowna. And if you watched an earlier presentation that Megan did, Nancy Roth from the Kelowna Historical Museum was on and kind of gave you a behind the scenes tour there. So go back and watch that and you can get an idea of where that meeting was held. But I was at that meeting and it was just the perfect day. Julie Silber was the guest lecturer that day. And she was talking about Amish quilts, which I love. Sarah Miller was there, and Sarah owned Kelowna Country Creations, a fabric store in Kelowna for many, many years. And I got to be the table mate with Sarah. I got to spend the morning and the lunchtime with her. And I think Marlene Armbrecht, who's on this call, Marlene, you might have been at that table with us as well. But I had such a wonderful time that day. It was my 50th birthday. I was so excited to be at the meeting. And at that meeting, they also have silent auction items that people donate. So they're set up all over the museum and their fabric, their books, there's patterns, there's half-started projects, anything that people wanted to donate. And then the money that was made went to the group and to help have speakers come in. And one of the items, as I was walking around and looking at different things, and again, there's a piece of paper attached and you would write your name and your bid. And we had until 1 o'clock. Once lunch was over and the afternoon session started, the bid stopped. So as I was walking around and bidding on different things, I came across a stack of pattern booklets. And on the top of that was a yellow and green applique quilt. And I thought, that's Aunt Gertrude's quilt. That's the pattern for Aunt Gertrude's quilt. And so I was bound and determined that I was going to go home that day with that pattern booklet. Now, it was wrapped up with some other things, both directions. And so I couldn't pick it up. I couldn't really look at it, but I knew that that was the pattern. So I think I ended up paying about $35 for that one pattern book, which I really, really wanted, but it was the pattern. It's in the 1950s Montgomery Ward pattern book. It's called Climbing Rose. And so I finally knew what the name of the pattern was. The final part of the story is that day I had brought that quilt with me as my show and tell quilt. because I was trying to figure out what the pattern was. So on Gertrude's 100th birthday, I decided I wanted to be a quilter. And on my 50th birthday, I found the pattern. Oh, every time I tell this story, I don't know why, it just chokes me up, but I just feel like there was a complete circle on that day. And that's how I got to be a quilter.
What a great story, Jody. Thank you for sharing that. We've got some more pictures of Jody's that we might see a little bit later as we kind of converse. I forgot to say out loud, although I did put it in the chat window, if you've got questions as we're going through our conversations today, just go ahead and pop those in the chat window yourself. Comments about what we're hearing, questions that you want me to pass on to Mary or Jody or either one. Our program today is very loosely planned, so we go where the conversation leads us, and you can help us be a part of that. So I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Mary now, and we'll hear how it is that Mary got started in the quilt publication biz.
Hi, everybody. Megan, thanks for asking me to come on and talk about this. It's really cool. Jody probably feels the same way. This specific conversation, right, about this topic is not something, I get to talk about too much. Usually it's the very enjoyable, but sort of, general talk about, about things and showing quilts, and that's great. But this is it's an interesting topic. Publishing is kind of in my blood, actually. I'm a second generation quilter, but my grandmother on my mom's side started the town paper in Norwalk, Iowa. And so I remember actually when I was really young, she would work at the newspaper office, or she at least was still helping out there a little bit, and, cutting and pasting, literally cutting and pasting, graphics and sort of typesetting and in that way. So I remember that. And then my mom is Marianne Fons, and she is, a pretty famous quilter. She is a person who has spent most of her life in the quilt industry, and she started with Liz Porter, love of quilting, Fonz and Porter's love of quilting. I was not quite a tot, but I was quite young when my mom started making quilts. I was not a tot when she started the magazine with Liz, but when she was a young woman in 1976, the bicentennial, like so many people who are out there who started to quilt, before, the latest sort of wave of quilting started with the Modern Quilt Guild and Jenny Doan, the YouTube sort of era, the YouTube generation. Mom started at the bicentennial time. The quilt craze was sweeping the nation, and she joined the extension office there in Winterset, Iowa, where the Quilt Museum is. It was up on the square, and and took a class on quilt making, and there she met Liz. So they started with a basket book, and I am in that book as a small child wearing like a basket vest or something. And Hannah, my older sister, is in that. Rebecca wasn't born yet, but Liz's kids, Katie Porter, her oldest, which Katie Porter, who's the congressman, is Liz's daughter, and not everybody knows that, but she's on the news quite a bit these days. But that's Liz's daughter. So Katie's in the book, and Congresswoman, I think I said congressman. And let's see, Lucas, her other son. So anyway, that was my first taste of publishing, I guess, as in the quilt world. I like to say that I learned how to make quilts on public television. I don't recommend it. It was not easy. I grew up in Iowa and then went to school in Iowa City for theater. And I have my master's in writing from the School of the Art Institute. I got that in 2016. But I grew up in Iowa and went to college. And when I got out of college, I moved to Chicago, which is where I am now. And I wanted to make my living as a writer and a performer. And I was doing that with a group of extremely talented people, the neo-futurists. Another story. But I was doing that and I was making a living, but it wasn't much, you can imagine, not a ton of money in performance art. So my mom asked me at one point if I wanted to be a guest on the TV show. By that time, Liz and my mom had been doing the public television show for many years. And it was a good gig and they paid me a little. So I said yes. And around that time, and it was fine. I didn't know how to make quilts, but I knew how to be, sort of perform on the show. I wasn't scared of the camera anyway. So I went on the show and it wasn't a disaster. So Mom and Liz around that time were selling Fonz and Porter, and they sold the company. And the people who bought it were kind of like, what are we going to do with this Fonz and Porter thing? If there's no Fonz and no Porter, we're in a pickle. So the powers that be sort of, their little mustaches and their sort of, well, I mean, they weren't like, weird about it, but they were like, come here, my pretty, Mary Fons, come here, maybe we'll put you on the show. And this was their plan, to maybe get me on the show, because Mom would probably stick around for a while if she could sew with me. So I did it. I said yes. And I was the co-host of Fonz and Porter's Love of Quilting for about 5 years. And I learned how to make quilts on public television because as I was growing up, I didn't make them. Mom was a quilt maker, but she made quilts for work. It wasn't a hobby for her, really. Of course, she enjoyed making quilts, one would hope, but she didn't sew, on the weekends for pleasure. She was editing a magazine and, deadlines all the time and making quilts for TV, making quilts for the magazine. So my sisters and I grew up, not really wanting to do that necessarily. But when I was 28, and this was around the time I was asked to come on the show, I had a very bad year. I was married briefly, disastrously, and that fell apart. And around that same time, I was diagnosed with ulcerative colitis at a very late, dangerous stage. And all of this kind of happened at once. I had many surgeries that went very badly. I was in the hospital on and off a long time, for long periods of time. And I like to say I had my quilt epiphany around that time. I woke up, in the middle of the night and was sort of seized with the desire to make a quilt finally. And I figured out that when your life is torn into a million pieces, for some of us, if anybody's, the people on this call, sometimes it makes sense to tear up perfectly good fabric into a million pieces and sew it back together again, So I did. I made my first quilt and I didn't know what I was doing. And suddenly I'm on the show doing it. Not everybody liked it at first. I took my lumps. Mom and Liz didn't have to deal with Facebook, when they were new. I looked at it once, never again. But the thing is about being on that show as a beginner, two things happened that were great. One is if you watch the show from the time I was on to now, when I left some years ago, 2015 or so, you see the evolution of a quilter. I learned how to do it. Anybody can learn how to do it. And so that's pretty cool. And, people definitely warmed up, over the years. And a lot of people have said to me that they started watching Love of Quilting because I asked all the dumb questions that they. So that it was a good experience. I started to I started Quilty magazine or began Quilty magazine within Fonz and Porter. It was a magazine for the beginner. When I was young, I was always making little magazines and writing poems, and I do consider myself a writer before anything else. Quilty was a 5-year-long endeavor. We did YouTube videos, one every week for 5 years. So there's 52 episodes every year for 5 years of Quilty. Basic lessons, a friendly atmosphere, teaching, the fundamentals. So I went to grad school. I left, Quilty closed. I went to grad school, left Fonz and Porter. And then I heard about this magazine called Quilt Folk. And I thought it would never work. Because Quilt Folk, if you know about it, there are no ads in Quilt Folk magazine. This is Quilt Folk magazine, one issue of it. Quilt Folk, yeah, there's no ads in this. And when I saw the first issue, I just thought, well, it's ridiculous. I mean, these beautiful pictures, these, long stories about quilt makers. It's just, there's no patterns in Quilt Folk. There's just, this is an article on Hoffman Fabrics. Anyway, so I didn't know that it would be a success, but then they did the Iowa issue and they did an article on Mom. And I said, there is something to this. What we do, I'm editor of Quilt Folk now. Every issue of the magazine, I'm not sure if you can see that or not. Every issue of the magazine focuses on a different state. I suppose we'll talk more about the magazine, but we travel the country and focus on a different state for every issue. Southern California, Vermont. I have some more issues here to talk about that, but Quilt Folk has been my job, my project here for about 5 years as well. And yeah, I'm quite happy being an editor. And yeah, we'll talk about how to make these issues in the pandemic, the travel magazine about quilts and quilters in a pandemic when you can't travel or be around people. So it's interesting. It's been fun. I hope that was okay. I don't know. I kind of bounced around a little. I get nervous still after all these years.
That was wonderful, Mary. Thank you. So I'm going to bounce off of what you just said. Quilt Folk is, in many regards, still kind of a baby magazine. And I don't mean that's the subject matter. It's young in the magazine world. And I don't mean that as an insult at all, because it's fantastic. But American Patchwork and Quilting has been around for how long, Jody?
1993 was the first issue. So we're at about 28 years right now. And then Quilt Sampler came along in 94. And Quilts and More has been around for about 15 years. So those are the three titles that fall under the Better Homes and Gardens brand here at Meredith. We also have, of course, our website, allpeoplequilt.com, and our American Patchwork and Quilting podcast. But in terms of the magazine business, we have those three that we're producing right now.
Okay. And so these three magazines are under the header or under the umbrella of Better Homes and Gardens, which is under the umbrella of Meredith Corporation, right? Yep. So if you can give us a brief, how did Better Homes and Gardens decide to get into the quilting magazine world?
It actually, Heidi Kaisend was really, there was one editor that was here for just a little bit to get things started, but Heidi Kaisend was the first editor, and Heidi actually was in the food area at Meredith. And so when they got ready to start a quilting magazine, they were looking for somebody that knew something about sewing. And Heidi, like myself, like a lot of our editors, Jill Mead, Elizabeth Beasy, we all are former 4-H'ers. We all loved 4-H. And so in addition to cooking, we also did sewing and know something about sewing. And for those of you that have followed Heidi's career too, so she owns Hen and Chick Studios right now in Conrad, which is a store, and then also is the publisher of American Quilt Retailer, which is for trade. It's more of a trade publication for shops. But Heidi was the first editor that kind of came on and got things rolling. And that's how they got started in 1993 with the quilting business.
And Heidi is actually going to be our guest 2 weeks from now. And we're going to talk a little bit more about her current role in supporting quilt shops and the rich, rich culture, abundance of quilt shops in Iowa and the All Iowa Shop Hop and that kind of stuff. So there's just a little teaser. Go ahead, Mary.
Heidi is featured in the Iowa issue of Quilt Folk as well. There's an article on her in the Iowa issue.
Yeah, and so the story that I got, and I don't know how accurate this is or not, but Iowa was the second issue of Quilt Folk, right after Oregon, and the magazine is based in Oregon. Is that correct?
Yeah, here in Oregon.
Okay, so that's a good, it's a good place for them to start. But the story as it was told to me was after they did the first issue and they were thinking about the second, they kind of asked around and, what's a state with a really rich quilt history And they heard Iowa enough times that they made that their second stop. And there's a pretty prominent feature of the Iowa Quilt Museum. We were babies. I mean, we were like brand new then. And I do not come to the quilt world or I did not come to the Quilt Museum with any experience. I actually was a music teacher for 10 years and somehow convinced the board of directors here that my skills as a music teacher could transfer to running to a museum. Jody, a similar story. And so it was just wonderful to be featured there. And somebody asked, it was Arlene, if you can still get a copy of the Iowa Quilt Folk. And we have copies of that, and you can purchase them through our online gift shop. And I will give that information at the very end. I think you can also purchase them directly from Quilt Folk, but if you purchase them from us, then we make a little money too. So, all right, so let's just jump right in and see where this kind of takes us. So whoever wants to go first, how have things changed in the last 12 months? And how have you managed to adapt to that? Because Mary, you told us that you traveled the country to produce Quilt Folk, and that got a whole lot harder just about 12 months ago. So maybe you want to go first, or Jody, it doesn't bother me either way.
I can start here. So we have 4 issues a year of Quilt Folk. Each issue is about 164 pages. And what we do is we research the state and we find extraordinary people, not just quilters, quilt collectors, scholars, historians, the Susie quilters, as we say, the just folks quilters, and then the superstars, it's a good blend. So we search, we do our research, and then we do all the pre-production and begin planning the travel. It's about 4 of us, myself, 2 writers, and a production sort of assistant. And we pile into a car. We take a flight and we pile into a car and we travel the state. Lots of Hampton Inns in my life usually. Love a Hampton Inn, and Holiday Inn Express, definitely my favorites. So we were in a year ago today. I was in Nevada, and this is. I pulled up the images on my computer, but I don't want to do the whole screen share thing. So this is the Nevada issue. I was determined when I became editor to get a Lone Star on the cover of a magazine at some point in my life. So we got it, and we got home on March 13th from that trip, all going to different spots. Oh, sorry, a photographer goes with us as well, of course. So that's when things really got crazy, right, with the pandemic about a year ago. And it became clear in April, well, we were supposed to travel in April or May for the next issue. And Mike, who started the magazine, Mike McCormick in Oregon, we both knew it couldn't happen. It wasn't safe. We couldn't anyway go anywhere. And we're a travel magazine, it was like, well, how are we going to do this? And there are silver linings in all of this. We have not traveled. I have not traveled all year. For issue 16, we had to figure out something fast to do. And I thought, well, what if we focus on a theme instead of a state? And I figured it had to be scalable. It had to be something that we could do again if we had to do it again. And so I thought, well, what are the themes of quilt making? Family, community, charity, friendship. And these seemed like, this is an idea that had legs. And so we chose the theme of family, and we made this. And it was the first issue that we solicited reader submissions about on the topic of quilts and family. And we got 260 some submissions. Some just would break your heart. Some certainly warmed your heart. We got a sample, we got an understanding of our readership too, because of all the, the people who sent in the stories. We have quilt makers of every socioeconomic background, all races, colors, creeds. It was really a great mix. So it was hard to pick the stories, but we picked a selection. There was one story in here, a woman made a quilt out of anger. Oh, I flipped right to it. She had a terrible family drama and she made a quilt about it. And so she said, not all family stories are good ones. Very true. So yeah, so that's what we did. Then for the next issue, we chose Connecticut because one of our photographers lives in Massachusetts. And at the time there was no travel restriction between Massachusetts and Connecticut. So she could drive over to Connecticut and get the photos. Her sister helped style the photos. And then we just did, we're in press for Illinois, which we did because in the winter. I was like, I would never pick the winter in Illinois. I'm sorry, but it's turning out really well. But myself and our other photographer, Azuri, live here, so we can do socially distanced photos. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot of masks in these issues. It's really been strange, but we have to be safe about everything. So this is the Connecticut issue, and yeah, lots of group pictures, kind of taken far away, but it works, and we're really proud that we've been able to keep doing it,
Jody, how have things changed at APQ?
Well, okay, so we do 6 issues of American Patchwork and Quilting a year, and we do 4 issues of Quilts and More and 2 issues of Quilt Sampler. Now, Quilt Sampler is a magazine where we highlight quilt shops in Canada and the United States. And similar to Mary's situation, if you can't travel, what is your magazine about? And so we had to figure out pretty quickly. When this all started happening a year ago, we were in shops. It was the week we were shooting shops number 3 and number 4 out of 10 for our spring summer issue. So we'd shot 2 shops at that point. So we were hoping, well, if we got shops 3 and 4 done, we're almost half. Can we keep going? Things started shutting down. It'll be next week, it'll be a year that all of us from Meredith were told, you need to start working from home. I think at that time we probably thought, oh, it's maybe 3 or 4 weeks. We'll figure it out, and how late and how long can we wait to do things. We were able to get all but 1 shop shot during March and April of last year. We had a shop in Canada, in British Columbia, that we couldn't get over the border to shoot. And shout out to our editorial and art director, Doris Burnett's the editor of that magazine, and Elizabeth Stumbo is the art director. And you talk about plan B, well, maybe plan C. Well, I think we had DEF. The amount of travel that they had to reschedule and figure out and try, and how are we going to get people? It ended up that we couldn't go, and we talked with all the shops about, if we can't get to your shop, we looked at submitted photos. That just wasn't going to be the quality that we were going to be happy with. We thought about just running the projects. Part of Quilt Sampler is also projects that the shop gets to highlight, and they get to sell kits. So at this point, we've approved their project designs. Their quilts are here, they're done. They have all this inventory sitting in their shop ready to sell. And we didn't want them to have to hang on to that any longer than they had to. So we were able to get 9 out of the 10 shops shot. We did just a 1-page little teaser for that Canadian shop. It's Cherry Tree Quilts. And we did run their projects because we wanted them to be able to start selling the kits. And so what we decided is that we'll go back and do the full-blown profile with them then in our spring summer issue. Well, that's the one we're working on right now and finishing up, getting ready to send to the printer. And we couldn't get across the border. We, again, tried as much as we could. We could not get across the Canadian border. What we ended up doing was hiring a Canadian photographer and a Canadian stylist. And it was somebody we'd never worked with before. We didn't know anything about them. We, of course, looked at their work and knew that we were going to be happy with it. It ended up being a wonderful thing. They did a great job. But that was how we ended up solving the issue where they didn't have to wait yet another issue for us to be able to get over the border. We work with a lot of freelancers. There are full-time photographers, but we also work with freelance stylists and freelance photographers. And just a shout out to all of those folks, because they definitely did lots of traveling. We had a photographer that set up a studio in his garage at home, so that we could shoot producty things and we could do some flat shots. Meredith has we have 9 different photo bays here. And so we have lots of space. We have 6 full-time photographers, but the building was shut down and we couldn't get in to do the things here. So we had to think of some different ways. One of the things we've done for photography is we like to do style shots in people's homes. Well, people didn't want us coming into their homes, and there were all kinds of issues. So we looked at model homes or show homes here in Des Moines. They were staged, they were beautiful. Nobody was coming in and looking at those places, but they were the perfect places for us to do some style photography. And Mary probably knows this, like when you're shooting photography, you're all gathered around that one monitor. The photographer's looking at it, the art director's looking at it, the stylists are saying, okay, move this and let's do that and let's go here. And we couldn't do that anymore. We couldn't be on top of each other like we were. So the photographer would be at one monitor. The art director is a ways away on an iPad. There wasn't a prop stylist because we couldn't have that many people in. And so that was a different way as well. Sometimes our art director was even off site. She wasn't even necessarily even in the same room as the photographer to try and get that photography done. But I will say, I think if you look at the magazines, because we're getting ready, we've done 6 issues of APQ now during the pandemic. We've almost done a full year of everything. I think if you go back and you look at the magazines that we've produced in the last year, you're not going to be able to tell that those were produced during a pandemic. I think they have done amazing, amazing work to give the readers the kind of product that they expected. Now, certainly my editor's letter talked about it. And after about the 3rd time I talked about creating an issue during the pandemic, I'm like, okay, that's over. You can't be saying that any more time. That's getting old in a hurry. But yeah, that's a few of the things that we've had to do in terms of trying to get out our product as best we could during this time.
There's one other thing that we are doing for this issue, for issue 18. One of the stories was in East St. Louis that I wanted to get a children's quilting project. Just really neat. I didn't want to give up the story, but East St. Louis is like 6 hours from Chicago. It's a long, Illinois is like really big. I didn't realize quite how big until we had to figure out, how to get our photographs. So I thought, well, what about an illustrated story? How might that work, And so we did it. And I went to the University or the Art Institute of Chicago, as I mentioned, for grad school. So I know a lot of artists. I worked at the paper there. So yeah, I hired one of my artists, my friends from grad school, and she's done a brilliant job. And I think it's something that we'll continue to do, right? So some of these, like the model home, it's like, sometimes it's like, oh, we should use this, even if we're not in a pandemic. This is a great solution. And I feel that the illustration is kind of that way. Yeah.
Well, this exact program is a case in point of that. We started doing these virtual programs because we kind of had to. We were shut down for 74 days with, no visitors, no income. We had an exhibit hanging that nobody could see. So we decided we would bring it out to the world. And then after a few of those programs, it was kind of like slapping yourself on the forehead and saying, gosh, why have we not been doing this before? And we certainly are going to continue this type of thing for a long time. I don't know if, probably not with the frequency that we are right now. Like you said, Mary, or you kind of alluded to, doing a video every single week for Quilty. That is a hard schedule to maintain, to keep up with. And thankfully, I do very little to prepare for these. It's not like I'm teaching or preparing step outs or anything like that. I basically just schedule people and then sit around like we're having coffee. But it's hard to sustain. Mm-hmm. So we've got a couple of specific questions in the chat window, and I'm going to go through those. But First one, while I'm kind of browsing through, is Mary, tell us about the artwork behind you. And then Jody, I want you to tell us about, you're sitting in the crafts lab at Meredith, so kind of tell us about that. But Mary, you go first.
Thanks. And also, speaking of artwork, I'd love to, if there is a moment, to show some of Quilt Folk, because we are newer than other magazines. I'd love to show folks what it looks like, right, and what we do. It'd be great. So this painting I've had for a long time. It's really big. I don't know, it's really big. And I got it many years ago. I saved up my money to get it. I bought it here in Chicago. It's called Disneyland of Fences. And there's some sort of, it's sort of apocalyptic. I think this looks like Mickey's eyeball. So there's some sort of very vague Disney references in there. But yeah, I don't know. Most people have quilts behind them. I thought, well, maybe I should do that too, but I just can't move my desk again. I keep trying to just, keep it fresh in this living room, and like, I just can't do it again. I was over there, I've been over here. It's a small apartment. My husband works here too. So just gotta find a place that makes you happy and, stay.
Right. Yeah. It looks like you have good lighting there where you are, though.
I've got the ring light, man. I've had to get the whole setup. I've got a microphone, it's a little production studio in here. And by the way, Megan, when we did Quilty, we filmed twice a year for 3 days each time and did 22 episodes in 3 days. So if you bunch that production together, it's a long 3 days. But it works.
Yes, on a very smaller scale, my husband and I are recording music for our church's online worship services. And we were going week by week for a while. And then finally we got to where we said, we need to be able to do these in chunks, because finding time, it seems like it's not so hard to find time to do it every week, but it just really is. Yes. All right, so tell us about the crafts lab, Jody, because this is probably like a quilter's dream to just get into the Meredith Crafts Lab and be able to just cut loose.
Well, we're very fortunate. We have some dedicated space here. We were in conference rooms for a while where we would set up machines if we needed to do some testing of patterns or we needed to make some samples for a quick photo shoot. And so we were in conference rooms for quite a while, picking machines up, putting them away. People were having meetings. And several years ago, we got dedicated space and they renovated it. We were able to have cutting stations. We have long arm machines. We film our videos in this room. And we recently, kind of during COVID, thought it was a good time to do a little bit of an upgrade and a freshen up. And so we have done that. And most of the people at Meredith have not even seen our new renovated space yet because people haven't been back in the building. But we just feel very fortunate that the company has allowed us to have space where we can have things up all the time. And we have storage for fabric. We have storage for our die cutting systems. Like I said, we have a long arm machine up and we have several machines on loan from companies that we can use to do testing as well as photography and how-tos and that kind of thing. So yeah, we feel very fortunate to have this space.
Yeah. Mary, let's pop back to Quilt Folk for a second. Couple of questions. What are the states that Quilt Folk will be focusing on in the short-term future, if you're allowed to say? And then talk to us a little bit about the printing process for Quilt Folk, because it's a thicker paper than we're used to seeing in a magazine. And you called it Quilt Folk magazine. I tend to just call it Quilt Folk because I don't know if you refer to it as a periodical or a magazine or whatever. So go for it.
Yeah, I honestly, sometimes I write, I'm editor of Quilt Folk magazine, writing to you to ask, this or that, like in an email if I'm composing that. And I think, some people call it, I call it Quilt Folk too, unless people don't know what it is, right? And then I say magazine, but many, many people, when they see it for the first time, exclaim, it's a book. This is a book, because it's perfect bound and it's, the matte paper, no ads. So, and it is more expensive because of that, it's 22 US, 24 Canada, because if you don't sell ads, you gotta charge more. But some people balk at the price, but then when they see it, they're sold, we're doing great, and issue 18, as I mentioned. So we've my fear that it wouldn't work is was wrong. I'm really glad. So yeah, we printed in Iowa, actually. That's where we print the magazine. I believe in Des Moines. They do a great job. And yeah, it's a matte paper. It's thick. And yeah, it's different. It's different.
So can you tell us where you'll be visiting in the next year or so?
Well, I mean, we used to sort of keep it a secret, but like, why? You know, we want the people to be talking about Quiltful. I think Florida might be next, for a number of reasons. One of our photographers is from Florida, so it makes sense to, you know, that she might go there if she can, and so then she'd be there. Florida, talk about states with lots of quilting. I mean, oh my gosh, there's just fun. And so I hope, I mean, I'd like to go. Those white sand beaches in Pensacola sound pretty good. But I think the family issue was so successful that we will do another themed issue, maybe every other year. But having the reader submissions it was amazing, and it was very popular. So I think we'll do it again. And if we can't travel again, we may have to do it. So it's a good solution. It's in our back pocket, you know.
Yeah, for sure. And you mentioned that it comes out 4 times a year. Mary, tell us why Quilt Folk doesn't contain any patterns. And I think that that's an accurate statement, although for a while there was kind of a companion publication.
Yeah, we did Quilt Folk patterns for a brief time, and then we didn't. We might again. These decisions are complicated, but we don't include patterns. There was one in the Iowa issue. We kind of feel like patterns are covered. You know, I mean, you have great magazines like, you know, from Meredith, American Patchwork Quilting, and Quilter's newsletter sadly is gone. I just got cried when I heard that. It was a Fonz and Porter title. But you know, the patterns that designers make and sell, there's so many places to get them, so many beautiful quilts out there. Barbara Brackman just published her 3rd edition of the Encyclopedia of Piece Quilt Patterns. You can't get it, it's sold so quickly. There's not patterns in there, but blocks. And, you know, the Quilter's Complete Guide, you know, there's all kinds of patterns, and there have been for so long since the revival. I mean, it's just since the 80s and 90s and up until now. So we felt that, and I joined as a writer on issue 4. And so we have felt, and Mike felt in the beginning, that what was missing was this content about the quilt makers and about the people who make the quilts, the quilt culture of America. That was not represented, we thought, and Mike thought. So that's why the patterns are done so well by other people. So we focus on the quilt makers instead.
And I should say I think most people who are logged on are at least somewhat familiar with this program. For a while I was kind of surveying whether people had been on for their 1st or 2nd or 3rd time, and we're getting a lot of repeaters, which is awesome. But that's really the niche that we're focusing on here too, is, you know, we don't have anybody on staff. It's certainly not me who's going to teach you anything about quilting. There's a lot of people who are doing that, and they're doing it really well. And we're looking at partnering with some of those people. But what we can bring from the Iowa Quilt Museum specifically is the stories of the people and the places in Iowa that are involved in quilts. So this is, you know, I kind of view this as we're taking the Iowa issue of Quilt Folk and we're expanding it and we're putting it online. You know, that's what we can bring, and that's what we're really passionate about, is besides just displaying and exhibiting quilts here at the Quilt Museum, is connecting people to the entire heritage of quilts that's happening in Iowa. And so that's wonderful for us. Jody, I know you sent me a few more pictures. So why don't I pop those up and you can kind of tell us about them, because you have a really interesting collection yourself. You want to tell us about, you mentioned these magazines, but here's some covers of American Patchwork and Quilting, Quilt Sampler, and you mentioned both of those. Tell us about Quilts and More. I'm not terribly familiar with that publication.
Yeah, Quilts and More The and more is probably what makes it maybe a little more different. So it's things like bags, pillows, pin cushions. In addition to quilts, we kind of see it as simpler projects, probably more so if you're just getting started in quilting, you might want to dabble in a home decor project or something that maybe isn't quite as difficult. And so the Quilts and More reader, we used to think it was somebody that was more of a beginner. The more research we've done, we found out it really isn't. She's the person that just wants to make things, and maybe between a larger, more complicated quilt, she wants to make pin cushions for her friends as gifts, or she wants to make a bag, or she wants to make a pillow or a baby quilt. We know a lot of people get started in quilting by making baby quilts or that first quilt for a grandchild. So we try and make sure that we've got those kinds of quilts in Quilts and More. Quilts and More is 4 times a year, and that's a newsstand only title. We know people would love to get a subscription to it. Sometimes it's hard to find, or it's on the newsstand and people don't get to it in time. Meredith Corporation is a huge corporation. In addition to Better Homes and Gardens, we have People and In Style, Martha Stewart Living, Rachel Ray's magazine, Food and Wine, Travel and Leisure, Parents. We just have, Traditional Home, Midwest Living, Southern Living. We have lots and lots of magazines in our corporation. And so not all of them can be subscription based. So at this point, the business decision continues to be that American Patchwork and Quilting will remain the subscription based title, and the other 2 will remain newsstand only.
And American Patchwork and Quilting, like Quilts and More, is a lot of patterns. Is that correct?
Right. It's a more patterned based magazine. We also have profiles of different quilters. We do what we call our favorite finds, where we have products that we showcase for folks. We have different how-to sections depending on what the issue theme might be. So it's kind of a variety of things, but mostly pattern based, right?
Okay. Let's see what's next on our photos. Oh yeah. So tell us about this quilt, Jody. This was your 40 isn't.
Oh yeah. When I turned 40, my small group made this quilt for me. And I apologize for the not getting a good flat shot of it, but it hangs in the hallway of our home. And I look at it and I touch it every time I go by it. It's called 40 Isn't Old If You're a Tree. And so my small group made this for me when I turned 40 in 2003. And I also have a photo of the label. So if you look at the quilt now, and then I'm going to have Megan show you the photo of the label, which I think it's so important that we show of the label, but the label shows who made each block and where it is on the front of the quilt, which, several years later, I don't always remember who made which block. And it's also so important because I think there's 5 or 6 folks on here who are no longer with us, who aren't living anymore, have died. And so I just love having this label on the back that tells me who made which block.
So I'll interject here because I do this every time I have the opportunity. Label your quilts, people. We encounter so many historical quilts here, and it's wonderful to look at the quilts, but it's heartbreaking that we don't know where they came from or who made them, and we can't attribute that wonderful work to anyone. So do not delude yourself into thinking that nobody's going to care about your quilts or nobody's going to care to know who made them. That's false. Label your quilts. Okay, I'm done.
True.
I have some sewing related collections that I have as well. So these are needle books, and you can see the one in the upper left there is what it looks like open. So these were given away. These all happen to be from grocery stores. So grocery store chains would give these away as just kind of little gifts and thank yous for shopping at the store. They had needles and little needle threaders in them, but kind of a subcategory of my collection is the ones from grocery stores. And I also love just little sewing things. So tape measures, thimbles, little scissors, The one in this photo, you know, you can get them for not very much money. The little tape measure there was 50 cents. And I love the ones that have advertising. I grew up in Cherokee, Iowa. And so this says Hornbush Drug of Cherokee. So I loved finding that, especially since it was only 50 cents.
Are you seeing the quilt now? Oops.
And then I also have quilts that I collect as well. So the one that you saw there just for a moment is a vintage Jacob's Ladder quilt. I have a son named Jacob. And so Jacob's Ladder quilts are one of the subcategories of quilts that I collect. This one is probably from, I would say maybe circa, probably about 1910.
Wow.
The grandmother's flower garden is next. It's probably taking a bit to load them on everybody else's computer.
I love hexagons. It's my favorite shape. And this was a quilt I got in Jamesport, Missouri, which is an Amish community. I love that if you look at this, you can see the diagonal rows of kind of colors. You can see the blue and the lilac and the yellow and the red. But the thing that makes this quilt really unusual is the 7 rounds of hexagons for the border. You sometimes see 3 or 4, but 7 is a lot. And considering these were all hand pieced and it's hand quilted, it's one of my favorite quilts. And then I love shirtings. 1910 is my favorite time period with the shirtings. And this pop of chrome orange in this quilt just makes me happy. I know some people absolutely hate it, but it's one of my favorite quilts.
It's my favorite, Jody. Awesome.
Yeah.
Now, Mary, you did some fabric design as well.
Yeah.
And some of your prints kind of remind me of shirtings. Maybe I'm crazy in saying that, but I know I saw one specifically that had your Heart Plus on it. So how did you get into fabric design?
Well, it was sort of it was a one and done project, but I wanted shirtings, Jody. I wanted more. And I love tiny prints. So it was Small Wonders. I did it for a year or so with Springs in South Carolina. And it was amazing. I mean, they have an archive. I was really there to see the archive, and dig into it. They have an amazing, incredible archive, just rows and rows of filing cabinets with deep, thick drawers of old fabric samples from mills. I mean, they have fabric swatches from 1790 or something like that, and a lot, of course, of the 1900s, early 1900s, late 19th century. And so the mill engravings, Jody, I'm sure you know the little animals and things. So I called it Small Wonders because those small prints are my favorites. I make small patchwork. I will show you a quilt that I made. This is less small patchwork in it. But when you cut up a wide, print, a large scale print, you lose the integrity of the print. You can't really go too small with a big splashy flower. So, so the small scale prints are my favorites because I like making, the smaller patchwork, traditional patchwork blocks. Yeah.
Tell us where that archive is again, Mary.
It's the Baxter Mill Archive at Springs Creative in South Carolina. It's not open to the public, but we do an article about it in Quilt Folk Magazine, South Carolina. Yeah, you can see a lot of those swatches.
And people can purchase back issues of Quilt Folk from the Quilt Folk website, right?
Yep. I think they're all in stock. We've reprinted the Iowa issue like 4 times. It's a very popular one. So Louisiana sells out too, but I'm pretty sure. And we keep reprinting them because if you're like me, if you're going to get a set of something, you need the whole set. Like if I miss issue 3, it's going to bother me, until I get it. So we keep them in stock.
Yeah. Nice. Keep going, Jody.
Yeah, this is just another quilt for my collection. I actually bought this at an Iowa, Illinois quilt study group meeting one year when they had the auction. So in addition to buying the pamphlet, I also bought this quilt one year.
I think that's the end of your photos that you sent me. Mary, did you have a photo or 2 that you wanted to share?
Yeah, great. Yes, thank you. I will.
While
share my
she's doing
screen.
that, I'm going to type a little bit into the chat window of how you can find the Iowa Quilt Museum. It's really easy, iowaquiltmuseum.org. And as I've mentioned, you can be connected to our online store where you can purchase the Iowa issue of Quilt Folk magazine, as well as other things. You can sign up for our mailing list so that you find out about programs, exhibits, and such like this. You can make a financial donation. You can find out how to become a supporting annual member. You can find out what exhibits are coming next, which, by the way, in just 2 weeks, we'll be opening a new exhibit of floral quilts from the collection of the New England Quilt Museum. Super excited about that. So find all of those things at iowaquiltmuseum.org. Jody, you want to tell people how they can connect with American Patchwork and Quilting, because the website is not American Patchwork and Quilting.
Right. Excuse me. It is allpeoplequilt.com. And you can also go to apqshop.com and you can buy individual patterns. We were finding that people, we don't have a ton of back issues. Again, I talked about how many magazines Meredith produces, and to have back issues of all of those sitting in warehouses is just cost prohibitive. So we don't have a ton of back issues that we keep on hand, but for the patterns that are super popular, we do single patterns that you can buy, and you can get those at apqshop.com.
Cool. All right, Mary, show us what you got, and then we'll ask you how we can connect with Quilt Folk as well.
Sure. Okay. So I'm going to share this. So what I'm going to share, by the way, the issues, it'll be hard to switch between the different issues. So what I'm going to do is show you some images from Quilt Folk Life. This is our first book,
Yes.
the coffee table book that we published this year. They're glossy pages this time. Actually, I think that's a page I'll go to. Please post for that. So, I don't have children, but I think I gave birth to that quilt. You know, they say you'll have a kid and then you'll forget, you know, how hard it was, and you have another one. And I think it's true. Maybe if I forget how hard that was, I'll do another book. But it was pretty tough, but worth it, I think. We're really proud of it. So I'm just going to open this. Can you see?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So I've opened up, you know, to a 2-page view. We do a lot of close-ups of quilts, a lot of detail shots. This is a quilt. I won't tell you about every quilt in the interest of time. I want to show you a lot of photos, but this is a quilt from New England when we did our Massachusetts issue. Yeah, a special story and an incredible quilt. One of my greatest sadnesses in life is coming on for the 4th issue as my first issue as a writer. That was Tennessee. It's great. But the 3rd issue was Hawaii. And I'm like, Mike, I'll never forgive him, you know, because going to Hawaii would have been really great. This is another Massachusetts issue, Cape Cod Quilt Guild, a group, the Bayberry Quilt Guild. So you can see we visit people in their homes. We go to their studios. This was from the Quilt Folk Life Pattern Project. That's Marsha McDowell, who's a scholar, brilliant at Michigan State University, a quilt scholar, and Denise Schmidt. If you know the Modern Quilt Guild, you know that's Denise. So we brought 2 people together to work on a project together. It was a lot of fun and pretty cool. Another detail shot of an old quilt. This is actually a quilt that belongs to someone we'll see in a minute, I think. Hmong textile, HMONG, the reverse applique on the Hmong textiles. The Hmong were people who escaped from Cambodia. They fled persecution in the 1970s. And this woman and her daughter live in St. Paul or Minneapolis. And this woman, Suzanne, her quilts are unbelievable. The reverse applique on her textiles, it's extraordinary. And they are quilted, not all of them, but you know, we explore different kinds of quilts in Quilt Folk. The people we meet are amazing. She is an unforgettable person. As soon as we got there, you know, snacks, drinks, you know, lemonade. This is the Louisiana issue was very powerful. These women, the African-American woman there was part of a group called the Quilting Queens of Minden, Louisiana, tiny town in the northern half of Louisiana. They got together to make quilts for Hurricane Katrina victims, but they disbanded after that and had not been together ever since. And we had a reunion of them, and yeah, and they hadn't seen each other in a long time. So that was really powerful. Just a few more. This is Gwen Marston, the late Gwen Marston. Many of you will know her name. We flew in a jumper plane to Beaver Island in Upper Michigan to visit her and get her story. And I mean, she's a legend. She passed away within a year of us taking this photograph and doing her story. She had a series of quilts, these small-ish square quilts, a series of 10. And I saw them in her studio and I was like, Gwen, do you have a clothesline? And she was like, yeah. And I said, let's hang them all, you know, on the clothesline. And they were extraordinary, so beautiful. And then I walked around, you know, as we were setting up the shot, and these are the backs of the quilts. We made a puzzle out of that image, by the way, you can buy on the website, I believe. Anna Maria Horner, Minnie Lee, she's 96 now, still making quilts in Tennessee. Yeah, Raylan Montoya in Utah. We have a very diverse group of quilt makers that we find and highlight. We feel like that's really important. It's part of our mission. Yeah, I mean, I can keep going. It's like a really thick book, so I won't, but that's down in Louisiana too. Maybe my favorite picture of the book, just extraordinary. So yeah, it's an honor to work on this publication, and I hope you'll check it out. All right, I'll stop the share. Oh, wait, I'll do one more thing. Let's see, I'll show you the issue of Quilt Folk that is coming up next. Oh, share screen. Yeah, I have to show it because it's one of my quilts. I didn't know if that was going to be okay, but I said no. I said I don't want to do that. That's not cool. But the art director said it's the best shot for the cover. So that's my quilt, little black dress, photographed here at my building on the roof in Chicago. All right.
Mary, is Quilt Folk Life, is that new original content, or is that all pulled from individual state magazines?
It's all pulled from the issues that we've made so far. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, cool. All right, so Mary, you go ahead and put in the chat window and tell us how people can connect with Quilt Folk to purchase a subscription or back issues or some of those things. Jody, I should have asked you, in addition to All People Quilts, are there websites for Quilts and More or Quilt Sampler that you want to put into the chat window? You can absolutely do. You're muted, hon.
Sorry about that. No, you can go to allpeoplequilt.com or apqquilt.com and that will get you to the place.
There, good, excellent.
And visit your local quilt shop. I guess I would say if you're able to do that, visit those folks. A lot of them carry the magazines, and we love it when you support your local quilt shop.
Right, which, as I mentioned, will be our topic of conversation in 2 weeks, the rich culture of quilt shops in Iowa. And I'm still working on putting together the slate of guests for that, but we will be there. Next week, the program is yet to be announced because I have yet to figure out what it's going to be. Today was actually supposed to be the end of our series because next week we're on spring break. That's a nice, neat, tidy way to tie things up. But we have just had an unexpectedly wonderful turnout in response to these programs. And I'm sure enjoying doing them. And so our program committee asked me if I would keep them going through the end of April. So I have 7 more weeks to schedule, which is wonderful because I have lots of content. I just got to get the people and the places lined up. So next week I may be trying to put together something that I tried weeks and weeks ago and just haven't been able to get it together. So, and a tour of the upstairs at Lori's suggestion. So we might try for that. Right. So again, you can find anything you need to know about the Iowa Quilt Museum, including recordings of this program and past programs at iowaquiltmuseum.org. We're happy to have you come on board as a member or to make a financial donation to keep supporting the Quilt Museum so we can keep making these things happen. Thank you so much to Mary and Jody for joining me today. I'm so happy to hear about how you are involved in making quilts happen in Iowa through your respective we still claim you, Mary, as an Iowan.
Yeah. I'm an Iowa girl forever. Yeah, totally.
All right. Thanks so much, everyone. We will see you next week. Have a lovely day.
Thanks, everybody. Good to see you, Jody. Bye. Thanks, Megan.